In September 1945, at one of the military cemeteries of the United States of America, the coffin with the body of the last soldier officially recognized as dead during World War II was lowered into the ground, which drew a symbolic line under the bloodiest conflict in the history of mankind. This global catastrophe has cost the American nation 405,339 lives, and each of these losses has left a permanent scar in the hearts of families from New York to California. This figure may seem staggering when viewed in a vacuum, but it takes on a completely different meaning when you remember that the American armed forces had to wage an all-out war of attrition simultaneously in two gigantic theaters of war, fighting against the two most militarized and fanatical regimes of the time, Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Nevertheless, if an unbiased comparative analysis is carried out, it becomes obvious that the human losses of the United States turned out to be incomparably less than the monstrous demographic damage suffered by other key participants in this massacre, such as the Soviet Union, which lost tens of millions of citizens, or Germany and Japan themselves, whose human resources were almost completely wiped out. The phenomenon of how America managed to crush the two titans of the Axis while preserving the bulk of its gene pool lies in a fundamental strategy according to which wars are won not only by bayonet attacks, but also, above all, in the deep rear, in design bureaus and on assembly lines. By the time the storm clouds of World War II had just begun to gather over Europe in 1939, the United States was actually in a state of military hibernation, having neither a combat-ready land army comparable to the European powers, nor a modern navy ready for global operations, nor a deployed military industry. However, the hidden economic potential of this country, multiplied by its unique managerial experience and ability to quickly mobilize, was so high that it allowed a miracle to be performed in a historically insignificant time, turning a peaceful state into an indestructible military mechanism provided with inexhaustible resources.
President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, with the insight of an outstanding strategist, clearly understood that the policy of isolationism was living out its last days, and America would inevitably have to intervene in the growing global conflagration, and therefore, without a massive, technically equipped, and well-armed army, it simply could not survive in the new redistribution of the world. After the tragic defeat of France on July 3, 1940, when the Wehrmacht was marching through Paris, the president approved an ambitious weapons program for 1940 and 41st years, which was the first step towards creating a military superpower. This program, which was wisely deployed for the prospect of a long and grueling war, provided not just for patching holes, but for fully ensuring the manufacture and transfer to the Ministry of War of all imaginable types of weapons and equipment, to equip a ground army of 1 million people in full wartime states. Moreover, strategic planning went further, providing for the creation of gigantic strategic stocks of the most important types of weapons and long-term equipment for the potential equipping of a 2 million army, as well as the construction of new production facilities capable, if necessary, of dressing, shoeing, and arming a 4 million army. Since December 1941, when, after the treacherous attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States suddenly found itself at war with three aggressive powers at once, Germany, Italy, and Japan, the pace of mobilization of national industry and human resources has accelerated dramatically, acquiring the character of an avalanche. The number of the U.S. Armed Forces, which amounted to a modest 170,000 people in September 1939, by the beginning of 1941 had grown to 1 million fighters, which in itself was an organizational feat. A year later, this figure tripled, demonstrating the capabilities of the American mobilization machine, and by the beginning of 1944, when the opening of the second front was being prepared, the number of people in uniform approached the fantastic mark of 10.5 million people.
The complete and total restructuring of the economy of a giant country in a military manner actually took place in 1942 year alone, which became a turning point in the history of American industry, when the total volume of military products produced 4 times exceeded the level of the pre-war 1941 year. If in the first quarter of 1942, 21% of the country's gross domestic product was spent on military needs, then in the first quarter of 1943, this figure soared to 42%, which indicated the nation's complete concentration on the task of destroying the enemy. It is noteworthy that this initial breakthrough was ensured by the use of existing production facilities and repurposed civilian factories, since the new industrial giants built under the Military Production Deployment Program had not even been commissioned yet, which indicates the incredible flexibility of American business. An interesting social fact that has forever changed the structure of American society is that the number of working women during this period reached 18,800,000 people, which had never happened before in the history of a country traditionally dominated by patriarchy. Women joined the machines, replacing men who had gone to the front, and the total number of people employed in military production reached 20 million people who forged victory in the rear. Another statistical indicator is also impressive. In December 1942, the historical maximum of American tank production was reached, when 4,772 combat vehicles were produced in 1 month. It's worth thinking for a second about the tremendous work behind this figure. After all, it was necessary to design equipment from scratch, conduct tests, build complex technological chains, establish cooperation with thousands of suppliers, providing supplies of armor, guns, engines, precision instruments, and other equipment, and all this was done in an incredibly short time, in a year or a year and a half. In total, from January 1942 to May 1945, American factories produced 98,600 tanks and self-propelled artillery installations, creating a steel river capable of washing away any enemy. This number is more than twice the total production of tanks and self-propelled guns in Germany, which produced 39,600 units, not to mention the absolutely meager 2,600 Japanese tanks, which looked like toys against the background of this power. Let's not forget that Germany was also opposed on the Eastern Front by the most powerful tank industry of the Soviet Union, which during the period 1942 to 45 years accomplished its labor feat and produced 92,715 tanks and self-propelled guns. No less, and perhaps even more powerful, was the United States aviation industry, which became a real nightmare for the Luftwaffe and Japanese aviation. During the 3.5 years of the war, 190,600 units of combat aircraft of all types were produced, which was many times more than 72,200 German or 49,000 Japanese aircraft. In fact, a giant shipbuilding industry was created from scratch, the scale of which is amazing even today. The number of people employed in this industry increased more than 100 times from 1940 to 1943, reaching 1,780,000 people working in 3 shifts. 87,000 units of various military vessels with a total displacement of 12 million tons were built, which allowed the Allies to dominate all the oceans of the planet. Germany or Japan could not even dream of such an industry capable of stamping ships like automobiles in the wildest dreams of their admirals. The displacement of the United States Navy increased from 847,000 tons in 1942 to 7 million tons in 1945, which marked the birth of a new mistress of the seas. In fact, the most powerful military fleet at that time appeared out of thin air, surpassing the British fleet by almost 3 times in terms of displacement, which numbered 2.5 million tons, and for centuries was considered the standard of naval power. Moreover, it is worth noting that during the war, the island monarchy received from the United States half of all its destroyers and escort ships, which formed the basis of anti-submarine defense during the Second World War. The Soviet Union also received tremendous help. As a result of Lend-Lease supplies, the number of patrol ships in the USSR Pacific Fleet increased 5-fold by the year 1945, compared with the beginning of the war. And the number of minesweepers in the Soviet Navy also doubled, which significantly increased its combat capability. The construction of a merchant fleet in the United States acquired huge, truly cyclopean proportions, since allies around the world had to be continuously supplied with weapons, strategic materials, machinery, food, and many others. It was necessary to transfer their multi-million troops across the oceans to remote theaters of war, and all this had to be done in the face of the most severe underwater attacks by German sailors who tried to cut these arteries of life. The American shipbuilding industry has achieved phenomenal results that seemed impossible due to the introduction of maximum standardization, a flow-sectional assembly method, and extensive cooperation. The construction time for standard Liberty-class transport vessels was reduced from an average of 355 days in 1941 to 56 days at the end of 1942, and in some record cases of propaganda significance, to 14 days. Just imagine, in just 2 weeks, and the finished ship with a displacement of 10,000 tons is launched and ready for loading. Of course, all the invaluable experience of mass conveyor production that had been accumulated by that time in the U.S. automotive industry was very useful here. The total displacement of the built transport vessels was 50 million tons, and by the end of 1942, the United States had a merchant fleet with a cargo capacity of 16,800,000 tons, which made the German attempts to arrange a blockade pointless. On July 19, 1940, President Roosevelt signed the historic Law on the Fleet of Two Oceans, which provided for the construction of Maine-class warships with a total displacement of 1,325,000 tons, the acquisition or conversion of auxiliary vessels with a displacement of 1 million tons, as well as the massive construction of new patrol, escort, and small ships of other classes. This ambitious program was designed to create a fleet that would be able to simultaneously defeat the naval forces of Japan in the vast Pacific Ocean and the combined forces of Germany and Italy in the stormy Atlantic. The structure of the American Navy's naval personnel was flexibly determined by the changing nature of the war at sea and new threats. If the number of classic artillery ships, such as battleships and cruisers, increased 1.5 or 2 times during the period 1941 to 44 years, then the number of aircraft carriers, which have acquired a huge, decisive importance in modern warfare, has increased almost 20 times. The fleet of destroyers and escort ships needed to protect convoys increased 5-fold, and the number of minesweepers that stifled the Japanese economy tripled. At the beginning of the war, the United States did not have a single specialized submarine chaser, and by the end, there were 900 units. This updated structure was designed to solve the most difficult two-pronged task, ensuring the safety of their own ocean communications and the destruction of enemy ones, as well as the transfer and landing of huge amphibious forces on enemy shores and their fire support, which the Americans were quite capable of due to their industrial might. But the threat was deadly. The German Navy sank ships of the Allies and neutral countries with a total displacement of over 21 million tons only during the period 1940 to 43 years. In total, 2,603 ships sank to the bottom during the war, on which 50,000 ship crews died, which speaks to the brutality of the battle for the Atlantic.
The struggle in the North Atlantic and the icy Arctic Ocean for convoys with cargoes supplied under the Lend-Lease program to the USSR from the ports of the USA, Canada, and Great Britain became particularly dramatic in 1942, when the losses of unarmed transports in convoys reached a monstrous 50%. From March 1943, in order to reduce losses, Allied convoys with military supplies for the USSR began to follow not through the deadly Arctic Ocean to Murmansk, but through the safer Mediterranean Sea, which by that time was controlled by the Allies, to the Persian Gulf for further transportation over land. Only at the end of 1943, when the threat had weakened, the sending of convoys to Murmansk resumed. I must say that almost half of all cargo sent to the USSR by the Allies did not go through the North or South, but through the Pacific Ocean to the ports of the Soviet Far East on ships flying the Soviet flag. During the war years, the port of Vladivostok handled 7,900,000 tons of imported cargo, which significantly exceeds the 2 million tons that passed through the port of Murmansk and 1,700,000 tons of the Arkhangelsk group of ports. In the Atlantic, the most complicated wiring of about 3,000 convoys, including 90,000 transports, was organized. At first, German submarines, acting with the tactics of wolf packs, when a group of submarines attacked a convoy simultaneously from different directions, sank up to half of the entire convoy, sowing panic and destruction. But already in the second half of 1942, the Allies proved to be stronger tactically and technologically. This fierce battle reached its bloody climax in March of 1943, and then the Americans, together with the British, took full control of the situation, turning the hunters into victims. The latest means of surface detection used by destroyers, patrol ships, and patrol aircraft have almost negated the main tactical advantage of submarines, their stealth, and with it the surprise factor of the attack. Centimeter-range radar stations made it possible to locate submarines on the surface at any time of the day and in any weather to accurately attack them. The anti-submarine warfare aircraft were equipped with powerful searchlights with which they could detect German submarines at night and bombard them with depth charges. The constant massive air raids on German submarine bases on the French coast, where they were sheltering in concrete bunkers, also had their results, making repairs and supplies difficult. An armada of 5,500 special-built anti-submarine ships and more than 20,000 small auxiliary vessels of the U.S. and British navies operated against German boats in the Atlantic. 25 specialized ships and 100 aircraft accounted for one German submarine, which made the chances of German submariners surviving slim. In the United States alone, the PLO forces numbered 73 escort aircraft carriers, 585 patrol ships, 77 frigates, 8 corvettes, and 659 submarine chasers. On the other side of the world, in the Pacific Ocean, the Japanese did not rule for long after their sudden strike. After major losses in the naval forces in 1941 and 42 years, the loss of the most important strategic positions and strongholds, the United States and Great Britain chose a methodical concept of advancing step by step with the successive capture and equipment of intermediate frontiers. Instead of a bloody frontal assault on all heavily fortified enemy points, the tactics of frog jumps were used, isolating the garrisons, creating bases on their supply routes, ensuring complete supremacy at sea and in the air, using the captured initiative to defeat the Japanese naval forces and systematically destroy their merchant fleet. Already in June 1942, the Japanese fleet, having lost 4 heavy aircraft carriers in the Battle of Midway, which was half of all Japanese aircraft carriers, suffered a catastrophic defeat from the Americans, which became the turning point of the war. This was followed by a series of major naval battles, which led to the fact that by the beginning of 1945, the U.S. Navy was absolutely and unconditionally superior to the Japanese in all respects.
In addition, at the end of 1944, a fairly strong British squadron arrived in the Pacific Ocean, strengthening the power of the Allies. American submarines, acting aggressively and effectively, destroyed more than 1,000 transport and over 200 Japanese warships during the war, cutting the veins of the island empire. At the beginning of the war, the tonnage of Japan's merchant fleet was estimated at 6 million tons, and during the war, the Japanese built or captured additional vessels with a displacement of 4,100,000 tons. However, in response, the Allies sank or seriously damaged Japanese ships with a total tonnage of 8,900,000 tons. In fact, the entire merchant fleet of the Land of the Rising Sun ceased to exist. More than half of the ships were sunk by American submarines, and about a sixth were aircraft carriers. The loss of the merchant fleet for Japan, a country deprived of natural resources and receiving almost all resources from the occupied countries, meant an imminent economic collapse and famine. In the European theater of war, the beginning of large-scale ground operations for the Americans dates back to November 1942, with the successful landing in North Africa as part of Operation Torch. This was followed by July 1943, when up to 470,000 American, British, and Canadian troops landed on the island of Sicily, which became the prologue to the fall of the Mussolini regime and heavy fighting in mountainous Italy. But the main, decisive events took place in less than 1 year, from June 1944 to May 1945. To land in northern France and conduct further offensive operations, the Allies concentrated on the British Isles a colossal grouping of 39 divisions, 12 separate brigades, and 10 special forces commandos and rangers, including 20 American, 17 British, 3 Canadian, 1 French, and 1 Polish divisions. In total, this invading army numbered 2,876,439 soldiers and officers ready to cross the English Channel. By this time, 58 German divisions were stationed in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, including 42 infantry, 9 tank, and 4 airfield divisions, which represented a formidable force. At first glance, the Allies did not have any overwhelming numerical advantage, but this is only at first glance. Technical equipment, monstrous firepower, both artillery and air, as well as excellent training and logistics, all this was present in abundance among the Allies and bore fruit. From the 6th of June to the 24th of July 1944, the 21st Allied Army Group managed to carry out the historic landing of the expeditionary forces in Normandy and occupy a bridgehead about 100 kilometers along the front and up to 50 kilometers deep. The amphibious assault took place under the cover of massive airstrikes and hurricane fire from naval artillery from 7 battleships, 2 monitors, 24 cruisers, and 74 destroyers that plowed through German fortifications. During the 48 days of fighting, the defending German troops lost 113,000 people killed, wounded, and captured, while the Allied losses amounted to 122,000 people, of which 73,000 were Americans and 49,000 British and Canadians. That is, the attacking troops of a strong, skilled, entrenched enemy lost almost as much as he did, although according to all the classical canons of military art, with a certain equality of forces, the defenders should lose half as many people and equipment, which indicates the skill of the Allies.
Then there's the rapid development of the operation in Normandy, the breakthrough from Beauvais, then the landing in southern France, the triumphant fall of Paris, and by the end of 1944, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, as well as part of Italy and Holland, were completely liberated by the Allies. The actions of the Anglo-American armies in Western Europe attracted up to a third of all German ground forces, about 2 million people, whom Hitler missed so much in the East. The ratio of the number of attackers and defenders at this stage was about 1-to-1. The position of Germany, trapped in a vice and attacked from the east and west, has become absolutely hopeless. But on December 16, 1944, German troops launched a desperate counteroffensive in the Ardennes, seeking to capture Allied warehouses in Liège and Antwerp and cut off their troops in the north from central France, repeating the success of the 40th year. 2 tank and 1 combined arms army of the Germans launched a surprise attack and forced the American troops to retreat in disarray, taking advantage of the bad weather, which chained Allied aircraft to the ground. Fierce fighting in the snow-covered forests continued until the end of December. An improvement in the weather at the end of December allowed the Allied aviation, numbering about 5,000 aircraft, to take to the air and deliver crushing blows to German communications, cutting off advanced tank wedges from supplies.
On January 3rd, a powerful Allied counteroffensive began, ending with the complete restoration of the front by the end of January. The Allies lost 17,600 people killed and wounded, the Germans 70,000 killed and wounded, but lost the last reserves of armored vehicles. The battles in the Ardennes showed that the best German units, despite the war years, retained high combat potential and skill. The nature of the theater of operations and difficult weather conditions contributed to the actions of the German troops, who used the surprise factor. However, in general, the Allied forces acted successfully, competently, and rationally, avoiding unnecessary casualties. During the last year of the war, they lost about 20,000 soldiers killed and dead per month against 25,000 men of the Wehrmacht. The Allied command took care of its soldiers, solving offensive tasks, retaking territory, and moving methodically and inexorably deep into Germany. How did it work? The Anglo-American command has always concentrated large strategic groups of ground forces and air forces in the direction of the main attack, ensuring overwhelming absolute superiority over the enemy, especially in technical means of struggle. As a rule, operations were carried out with an overall superiority of 2 or 2.5 times over the enemy in infantry, 4 to 6 times in tanks, and 10 to 20 times in aviation. The offensive operation of the Allied army groups began with a breakthrough of the enemy's defense only when it was reliably and guaranteed suppressed by fire. Large tactical, and in some cases, heavy strategic aviation forces played a primary role in this fire suppression of the defense. Bombing strikes were carried out in the breakout areas with such a suppression density that reached up to 300 tons of bombs per square kilometer, turning the area into a lunar landscape. If the troops met strong resistance, they did not rush into suicidal attacks but stopped. The offensive resumed only after aviation and supporting artillery had reliably ground the pockets of resistance to dust. In Germany, in the years 1940 to 44, the production of ammunition amounted to 8,590,000 tons. Until 1943, almost all of these munitions were spent on the Eastern Front, and it is clear why. The main war was fought there. In 1943, 696,000 tons were spent on the Western Front, and 1,862,000 tons of ammunition were spent on the Eastern Front. But 1944th year came, and the German ammunition consumption on the fronts was almost equal. On the Western Front, 1,400,000 tons, on the Eastern, 1,950,000 tons. The Americans, having a gigantic resource of 17,887,000 tons of ammunition of all kinds, used up 6 million tons in Europe in a year, which is 4 times more than the German troops could afford. The U.S. Air Force dropped 1,548,000 tons of bombs in the European theater of operations alone, raining steel on the enemy. The United States Air Force began active air operations against Germany as early as 1943. During the preparatory period and during the invasion in 1944, the main objective of strategic aviation was to completely disrupt railway traffic between Germany and Normandy, isolating the battlefield. By October 1944, almost all West German transport was paralyzed. Synthetic fuel, nitrogen, methanol, and rubber plants were systematically attacked, which deprived the German war machine of fuel and resources. Naturally, this had a very serious impact on both the provision of troops and the economy as a whole. Up to 20% of the housing stock was also destroyed. About 300,000 civilians were killed, who actually became hostages of an all-out war. The air offensive against Germany forced the mobilization of half of the entire German fighter aircraft to protect the sky and use about 1 million people in the air defense system, distracting them from the front, which could not but affect the defensive potential of Germany.
The Americans made a significant, indisputable contribution to the defeat of Germany, as well as the Allies as a whole, acting as a united front. Although, of course, the fate of Germany was largely decided in the titanic battles on the Eastern Front. If the Allies had not opened a second front, Germany probably would not have been able to resist the might of the USSR anyway, but the price of this victory would have been even more terrible. Of course, more Soviet soldiers would have died, but how much? It is inconceivable that Germany would completely expose its positions in the West for fear of being stabbed in the back. Therefore, if additional units from Western Europe had appeared on the Eastern Front, their number would not have been decisive. Actually, this was shown by the 1943rd year, in which the losses of Soviet troops killed and dead amounted to about 3.5 million people, and in the previous year and a half, about 8 million. In 1944 and 45, the ratio of casualties to deaths was 3.5 million Soviet soldiers against 2.5 million German soldiers. Of course, without the active participation of the Allies, the USSR would have lost significantly more, and this terrible bill would have cost millions more lives. And even in the face of the Allied offensive on the Western Front, American Lend-Lease aid made the Soviet army more mobile thanks to thousands of trucks, more powerful thanks to supplies of explosives and metals, and in the end, fed thanks to food supplies. All this gave her strength and luck, and saved soldiers' lives as much as it was possible at all with that tough style of management of the Soviet troops. In the Asian theater of operations, the war was different, but no less brutal. During the 4 years of the war with Japan, U.S. losses amounted to about 250,000 dead and deceased. The losses of the British Empire's troops amounted to about 300,000 people. According to American estimates, the Japanese suffered 1,219,000 dead and died of wounds, including 126,000 in China between the 42nd and 45th years. But this ratio covers a 4-year period, at the beginning with which American and British troops suffered a number of humiliating defeats and left large territories in a number of countries and colonies to the enemy. However, then the situation begins to change significantly. At the beginning of 1943, Japanese troops were forced to leave one of the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal, after 6 months of grueling fighting in the jungle, which was the first sign of a turning point. In June 1944, 127,000 Americans stormed the island of Saipan. The Americans suffered 3,500 casualties during the fighting, which lasted several weeks, against 30,000 Japanese, who fought to the last bullet. In August 1944, the Americans took full control of the Mariana Islands, gaining bases for bombing Japan itself. To storm the small volcanic island of Iwo Jima with a garrison of 21,000 people, the American command concentrated an armada of 111,300 people, 1,522 aircraft, and more than 680 ships. For 2.5 months, careful preparations were made for the landing. The island was continuously bombed and shelled from the sea, dropping 6,800 tons of bombs on a piece of land with an area of 10 square kilometers. On the morning of February 19, 1945, after the most powerful artillery and aviation training, the landing of American units on the southeast coast of the island began. The fighting was mostly over by the 6th of March, but the cleanup continued. On March 26th, the surviving 1,000 soldiers and officers from the garrison of Thousands surrendered. 22,000 Japanese died in tunnels and bunkers. The Americans lost 6,821 people killed. The commander of the garrison troops transmitted a poignant suicide radio message. "Our soldiers are dying one after another as a result of continuous enemy attacks. All the ammunition is out, there is no water. With a loud banzai, and together with the officers and soldiers, I go into the last battle."
At the landing and capture of Okinawa became the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. The combined expeditionary force that attacked Okinawa consisted of 1,213 ships, 564 carrier-based support aircraft, and 451,866 Army soldiers and officers, including Army and Marine divisions. In addition, these forces were directly supported and covered by a high-speed aircraft carrier formation with 82 ships and 919 aircraft, and a British aircraft carrier formation of 22 ships and 244 aircraft. The United States Strategic Air Force's 21st Bomber Division also supported the invasion with its heavy bombers. The landing began on the 1st of April, and the final surrender took place on the 21st of June. 26 American ships were sunk and 164 damaged by the attacks of 2,000 suicide kamikaze pilots, which came as a shock to the fleet. Aviation losses amounted to 763 aircraft. On shore, the Americans lost 7,213 people killed and missing. Losses at sea from kamikaze attacks amounted to 4,907 people killed and missing. 107,539 Japanese people were killed. 23,764 civilians were believed to have been killed. The Japanese Navy lost 16 ships sunk and 4 damaged. In addition, the Japanese lost more than 7,800 aircraft. The loss ratio was 1 to 10. In the years 1942 to 45, the Americans carried out 669,000 combat sorties and dropped 500,000 tons of bombs in the theater of military operations against Japan. In 1945, the Philippines was completely cleared of the Japanese. At the same time, the U.S. 7th Fleet supports offensive operations in the southwestern Pacific Ocean led by the 1st Australian Army. By early July, the northern coast of New Guinea, Kalimantan, and then the islands of Sulawesi and Java were under the control of the Australian Armed Forces. By August 1945, Japan had completely lost its oil sources, and its transport arteries had been cut. Her troops in the countries of the South Seas were blocked, isolated, and defeated. In the spring of 1945, the Americans began methodically bombing the main cities of Japan at night. Instead of high-explosive bombs, terrible incendiary bombs were used, causing firestorms in wooden cities. The first such raid was carried out on Tokyo on March 9th, when 185,000 people burned to death or suffered severe burns in a fiery inferno. In the 66 cities that were raided, 40% of the built-up area was destroyed and 104,000 tons of bombs were dropped. According to Japanese estimates, 260,000 people were killed and 412,000 injured in Japan, leaving 9,200,000 people homeless. In addition, 2,200,000 houses were destroyed or burned. The bombing and the resulting dispersal of factories reduced production, but the main reason for the decline of the Japanese economy was the catastrophic loss of merchant ships. Although the raids on cities and industrial enterprises greatly accelerated the general decline of the Japanese economy, however, it was useless to bomb enterprises in many industries, since they were already inactive due to the lack of raw materials that lay on the ocean floor. The Allies intended to land troops directly on the island of Kyushu on November 1, 1945. If successful, a landing on the main island of Honshu was planned on March 1, 1946. During the Yalta Conference, Roosevelt, in a conversation with Stalin, spoke about the undesirability of landing American troops on the Japanese islands. This will be done, he noted, only if absolutely necessary. The Japanese have an army of 4 million on the islands, and the landing will involve heavy losses. However, if Japan is heavily bombed, then one can hope that everything will be destroyed, and thus many lives can be saved without landing on the islands. In fact, in August 1945, the Japanese army had the equivalent of 65 divisions on the Japanese islands, but there were only enough full-fledged weapons for 40 divisions and ammunition for only 30. In preparation for the final battle, the Japanese created the People's Militia Corps, which included all healthy men between the ages of 15 and 65 and women between the ages of 17 and 45 out of 28 million people who were ready to put up fanatical resistance. Weapons, training sessions, and uniforms were sorely lacking, and some men were armed only with sharpened bamboo spears, ready to die for the emperor. But the Americans were seriously afraid of the fanaticism of the Japanese population and the bloodbath that could follow the invasion.
And yet, the landing was not necessary. The Japanese leadership, faced with total annihilation, found it necessary to capitulate. The decisive factors that pushed the Japanese leadership to surrender before the Allied invasion began were the entry into the War of the Soviet Union, which defeated the Kwantung Army, and the atomic bombing of Japanese cities. Thus, to summarize, we can say that the Americans took care of their soldier, putting technology and firepower at the forefront. Although there is no war without victims, and every death is a tragedy, the price paid by the United States for defeating two sophisticated and fanatical nations is incommensurable with the monstrous sacrifices suffered by the defeated countries. Or even more so, the Soviet Union, which took the brunt of the land war. A country that by the autumn of 1939 had virtually no army, navy, or military industry, rebuilt its economy in the shortest possible time, and already in 1942 entered into a fierce battle on the ocean, preparing the material and strategic prerequisites for victory on land. And she won this battle thanks to the strength of her spirit and the power of her factories. The entry into the war on the European continent occurred at a time when the fate of Germany was already strategically predetermined by the Soviet armies that had broken the back of the Wehrmacht. But the Allied landings certainly accelerated the fall of the aggressor and brought the long-awaited peace closer. Moreover, the American command achieved victories without overwhelming the enemy with corpses, but using overwhelming firepower, absolute superiority in aviation, and a lot of armored vehicles. This made it possible to minimize its own losses while preserving the nation's gene pool. The same rational algorithm worked in the Pacific Ocean, where in individual operations, the Americans lost 10 times less in killed and dead than the defending Japanese, who preferred death to captivity. The problem of losses for the American military had another important moral aspect. It was openly discussed in a democratic society. It was not a secret, and every commander felt responsible for the lives of his people. All the military honors worthy of heroes were given to the dead Americans. Most of them were transported across the ocean and buried in their homeland, in their native land. The Arlington War Memorial features a majestic monument depicting soldiers attacking the enemy and hoisting the victory banner, a symbol that their sacrifice was not in vain. If you are impressed by this analysis of the industrial and military power of the past, and you want to learn more about the hidden mechanisms of history, do not forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your opinion in the comments. Was this victory a triumph of technology or spirit?